The quiet of the suburban neighborhood was shattered by the frantic barking of Shadow, a muscular German shepherd. His deep, throaty growl echoed down the street, warning anyone who dared come too close. In the front yard of a modest home, Shadow stood protectively between Lily, a 7-year-old girl clutching her dropped candy, and the officers who had arrived in response to a call. Lily's eyes were wide with fear as she bent down to pick up the candy that had slipped from her hand. She didn't understand what was happening, but she knew that Shadow wasn't going to let anyone near her. "Stay back!" Shadow barked again, his voice commanding, sharp. He didn't need to speak the words. His posture, rigid and fierce, told the officers all they needed to know. Stay away from his girl. The officers hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. They had come to de-escalate the situation, but something was wrong. The dog wasn't just barking. He was showing teeth, standing between the child and them, as though daring them to approach. His stance, defensive and rigid, spoke of training, of something deeper than simple aggression. "Stay back!" shouted Officer Jenkins, his hand instinctively reaching for his holster. "I don't know what's going on here, but that dog's aggressive." But Shadow wasn't aggressive. Shadow was loyal. Shadow was protective. He was doing what he'd been trained to do: keep Lily safe. Yet, in the heat of the moment, the officers didn't see that. They only saw a large, potentially dangerous animal, and in their panic, they misread his intentions. The barking intensified, and in one horrifying moment, Officer Jenkins drew his weapon. "Back off now!" he yelled, his voice shaking. But before anyone could react, the shot rang out. Shadow fell to the ground with a heart-wrenching yelp, his body crumpling in the street as Lily screamed, running toward him, her hands trembling. The candy lay forgotten at her feet, crushed under the weight of the tragic mistake. The officers stood frozen, unsure of what to do. The silence that followed the gunshot was deafening. The crowd of bystanders, who had gathered at the scene, whispered in horror, watching as the dog they had all grown to love lay motionless in the street. Daniel, Shadow's owner, had been working in his garage when the gunshot rang out. The peaceful hum of his tools was suddenly drowned out by the noise that had shattered the air. He ran out of the house, his boots thudding against the pavement, heart racing as he reached the scene. When he saw Shadow lying there, lifeless, and Lily crying uncontrollably by his side, something inside him snapped. But it wasn't rage. It wasn't fury. It was a chilling calm that descended upon him. His gaze never wavered from the officers, who stood in stunned silence. There were no words, no protests. Daniel just stood there, staring. In that moment, the past he'd left behind, the military life, the bloodshed, the missions, returned to him. But this time, it wasn't about war. This was personal. The streets were eerily quiet now, save for the distant hum of emergency vehicles and the murmurs of neighbors gathered outside. The officers were still standing motionless, their eyes trained on Daniel as he knelt by Shadow's side. His hands, steady as a surgeon's, gently lifted the dog's head, his fingertips brushing the lifeless fur. Lily, still sobbing uncontrollably, clung to Daniel's side, her small hands gripping his arm as she tried to understand the tragedy unfolding in front of her. Daniel's expression was unreadable, his face pale as he stroked Shadow's fur, but his eyes were sharp, piercing. There was something behind them, a coldness that couldn't be ignored. Officer Jenkins, the one who had fired the shot, approached with caution. "Sir, He stopped, his voice faltering as he looked at Daniel. There was no apology in the man's voice, just confusion. He had made a mistake, but Daniel's gaze was unrelenting, as though he could see through the officer's every move. Daniel finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "You made a mistake," he said, the words almost a whisper. "But it's not one you can undo." Lily, oblivious to the tension, hiccuped between sobs, her heartbroken cry for Shadow piercing the silence. Daniel looked down at her, his hand resting on her shoulder, before he turned back to face the officers. This isn't how it was supposed to be. Shadow was more than just a dog. Daniel's calmness was unsettling, and his lack of visible anger was perhaps the most terrifying thing of all. His military training had taught him to suppress emotion, to remain stoic in the face of danger. But now, it wasn't just a technique, it was his very nature. In the quiet of that moment, it became clear that Daniel wasn't just some ordinary man. His past, his unspoken life, lurked just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The officers, all of them visibly shaken, exchanged uneasy glances. Daniel, still kneeling, didn't move. He was holding it together, but barely. As the night wore on, Daniel quietly collected Shadow's body, wrapped in a blanket. He didn't speak to anyone. His movements were deliberate, controlled, like a man who had done this 1,000 times before. The neighbors murmured their condolences, but Daniel didn't hear them. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even sad. Not yet, at least. He was numb. Later, after the scene had been cleared, Daniel and Lily stood in their small kitchen. The house was quiet except for the occasional sniffle from Lily, who had curled up on the couch with a blanket wrapped around her. Daniel sat at the table, his hands clasped tightly, his mind far away. He hadn't been this still in years. Lily looked up at him, her eyes red from crying. "Daddy, where's Shadow going?" Daniel's jaw tightened as he stared at the empty space in front of him. He could hear his own voice, but it didn't sound like his own. "Shadow, he's gone, sweetheart. But why did the police shoot him? Why did they hurt him?" Lily asked, her voice trembling. Daniel exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table. "It was a mistake. People make mistakes, Lily. But it doesn't mean they can't be fixed." Lily sniffled, wiping her nose with her sleeve. "But I want Shadow back. I want him to be here." "I know," Daniel replied softly, his voice cracking for the first time since the incident. But his grief wasn't visible to Lily. His pain was buried deep, hidden behind layers of discipline and years of combat experience. There was something dangerous about him in this moment. Not because he was violent, but because he had learned how to lock away his emotions. Daniel stood up, his gaze fixed on the doorway. His expression softened for just a second, then hardened again. The past was coming back, and with it, a quiet storm was brewing. That night, after Lily had fallen asleep, Daniel went to the garage. It was his sanctuary, his place to think, to plan. As he walked past rows of tools and car parts, his hand brushed against the old, worn military duffel bag hanging from the wall. Inside, the remnants of his old life were still there: maps, encrypted files, weapons, and most importantly, the memory of who he used to be. The silence in the garage was thick, but Daniel welcomed it. He didn't need the noise of the world right now. He needed the quiet to think, to remember. His past was not something he liked to talk about. The Delta Force training, the covert operations, the men he had left behind. After his wife's death, he had tried to escape it all. He had wanted to live a simple life, raise his daughter, and keep her safe. But now Shadow's death had dragged him back into the world he thought he had left behind. And the officers who had killed Shadow, they weren't going to get away with it. Not on his watch. The next few days passed in a blur of grief and silence. The police had wrapped up their investigation into the shooting incident, but Daniel knew better than to trust their report. The answers they gave didn't add up. Shadow's death was a tragic mistake, yes, but Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something more was at play. He spent long hours alone in his garage, the only sound the rhythmic click of his tools as he methodically cleaned and polished old weapons, his fingers brushing over each piece with a familiarity born from years of training. Each motion felt automatic, a part of him reconnecting to the past he had tried to leave behind. But it was no use. His old life was calling him back. Daniel's investigation wasn't going to happen in the open. He was no stranger to surveillance and gathering intel. In fact, he had been trained to do it in ways most people couldn't imagine. The police department, corrupt as it was, wouldn't even know he was watching. It began with simple inquiries. Daniel used his skills to track down the officers who had been present the day Shadow was killed, specifically Officer Jenkins. He found out where Jenkins lived, what bars he frequented, and who his contacts were. Daniel had no intention of confronting him directly. For now, he simply watched. The first lead came when he noticed Jenkins meeting with another officer, a detective named Randall, in a dark alley behind a local diner. Daniel had a clear line of sight, hidden behind the shadows of a nearby building, and he watched as they exchanged a small envelope. It wasn't the kind of exchange that happened between upstanding officers. His instincts kicked in, and he made a mental note to investigate further. The next day, he used his military contacts to dig deeper into Jenkins and Randall's past. It didn't take long to uncover a disturbing pattern of behavior. Both officers had been involved in a series of dubious transactions: weapons trafficking, illegal property seizures, and worse. The K-9 units, which were meant to protect and serve, had been co-opted as part of a much larger criminal enterprise. The dogs were being used to intimidate, to seize property from citizens under false pretenses, and to enforce the will of the corrupt officers. Daniel felt the rage stirring inside him again, but he didn't let it control him. He knew what he had to do. This wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. Real justice, the kind that wasn't going to be served by the very people who had sworn to protect the public. He set his plan in motion. With the help of encrypted messaging and covert surveillance equipment, Daniel began tracking down the officers involved in the trafficking ring. He used his knowledge of technology to hack into police databases and gather information on their operations. It was slow work, but Daniel was patient. He knew how to be patient. He had spent years operating in the shadows, waiting for the right moment. The deeper he dug, the more he uncovered. Jenkins and Randall were just the tip of the iceberg. Daniel's investigation revealed an intricate web of corruption, an entire network of officers involved in illegal dealings, using their authority to cover up their crimes. The more evidence Daniel gathered, the clearer it became. The police department wasn't just dealing with bad apples. It was rotten to the core. Daniel's mind was sharp, but so were the risks. He knew he had to be careful. He couldn't just confront these men directly. He needed irrefutable evidence to take them down. If he didn't play this right, everything could backfire. That night, Daniel drove to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. He had traced one of the officers, a Sergeant Lawson, to a secret meeting. Lawson was a higher-ranking officer, involved in some of the larger operations. This was the break Daniel had been waiting for. He parked his car a block away and approached on foot, blending into the shadows. His military training kicked in, every step measured, every sound calculated. He reached a vantage point where he could observe without being seen. Inside the warehouse, he saw Lawson meeting with several men, drug dealers, gun runners, and other criminals. They were exchanging cash, weapons, and documents. Daniel's heart pounded, but his hands were steady as he recorded everything. He had the proof now. Daniel's mission was clear. He would deliver this evidence to his old contacts, federal agents who owed him a favor from his Delta Force days. They would take care of the rest. As he slipped away from the warehouse, the gravity of what he was about to do settled over him. He wasn't just exposing a handful of corrupt cops. He was tearing down a system that had allowed this to happen. And he was doing it all from the shadows, just like he had been trained to do. But this time, it was for more than just a mission. This was personal. The pieces were in place. The trap was set. The night was still, but there was a palpable tension in the air. Daniel stood at the edge of a crumbling parking lot, his eyes scanning the shadows. His breath was steady, his mind sharp. Every muscle in his body was tuned to the task at hand. Every movement calculated. Tonight was the night. The trap was set, and the pieces were finally in place. He had done everything by the book: surveillance, intel, infiltration, and now, the final phase. The corrupt officers, including Officer Jenkins and Sergeant Lawson, were about to meet with a criminal syndicate in a secluded warehouse. Daniel had spent days tracking their movements, collecting evidence, and lining up his contacts. Now, all he needed was for them to take the bait. He glanced down at the encrypted phone in his hand. A text message from his federal contact, Agent Russo, confirmed that the operation was a go. Federal agents were already in position, ready to take the officers down once the evidence was delivered. Daniel's heart rate didn't increase, even as the stakes grew higher. His military training had taught him to stay calm under pressure. Every mission had been about precision. Timing was everything. And tonight, the timing was perfect. He watched as the officers, Jenkins, Lawson, and several other corrupt cops, pulled into the parking lot in unmarked vehicles. The dull hum of the engine and the shuffle of tires on gravel were the only sounds as the men emerged from their cars. They didn't notice the black SUV parked in the shadows, its windows tinted and its occupants hidden from view. Inside, Daniel's old military contacts, now working with the feds, were waiting, ready to execute the final stage of the operation. Daniel stood up and silently made his way closer to the warehouse. He had a perfect view of the meeting from the vantage point of an abandoned office building across the lot. With every step, his mind raced through the plans, rechecking every detail. His emotions, buried deep, were still there, lingering just beneath the surface. This was for Shadow. This was for the betrayal of trust that had cost him a friend, a protector, and a piece of his family. The officers entered the warehouse, and a tense silence filled the air. Daniel, using night vision goggles, could see them interacting with the criminal syndicate, drug dealers, arms traders, and a few unknown faces. The officers were discussing a large shipment of weapons, the deals arranged, and the illicit profits. They were so focused on their crime that they didn't notice the hidden cameras Daniel had planted around the area. His eyes scanned the scene through the goggles, capturing everything. Minutes passed like hours. Daniel was calculating the next step, waiting for the signal from Agent Russo. It came in the form of a single word. Now, the trap had been sprung. Suddenly, the hum of the parking lot was broken by the sirens of multiple federal agents' vehicles pulling into the lot. The sound of doors slamming and agents shouting orders echoed through the night air. The officers, Jenkins, Lawson, and the others, turned toward the commotion, their faces going pale as they realized what was happening. Before they could react, the federal agents moved in. Guns drawn, they surrounded the criminals, securing the perimeter. Jenkins and Lawson froze, their hands instinctively raised in surrender. The realization of their betrayal, and the consequences of their actions, was written on their faces. "Get on the ground now," a federal agent shouted. The officers complied, their bodies shaking with fear. They knew it was over. From his hidden position, Daniel watched the scene unfold, his eyes cold. He saw the officers being cuffed and read their rights, their world crumbling as they were led away in cuffs. But for Daniel, there was no satisfaction in this moment. Just the quiet, steady thrum of justice being served. Once the last of the criminals had been taken into custody, Daniel slipped away from his vantage point, disappearing into the night before anyone could connect him to the operation. The agents knew the evidence he had provided. Proof of the officers' involvement in the criminal syndicate would lead to convictions. The justice system would do its part now. But for Daniel, it wasn't just about bringing down corrupt cops. It was about honoring Shadow's memory, about exposing the rot within the system that had led to his friend's death. Tonight, justice had been done, but it was a quiet victory, one that left Daniel's soul unchanged. The pain of loss still lingered, and no amount of retribution could bring back what he had lost. As he walked through the darkened streets, the faint echo of Shadow's barking seemed to follow him, a reminder of the loyalty and love that had driven him to this point. But even in the midst of his grief, there was a sense of closure. The world had righted itself, just a little. Daniel's phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from Lily. "Is Shadow coming home soon?" Daniel stared at the message for a moment before typing a response. "Not yet, sweetheart. But we'll always remember him. I promise." He slipped the phone back into his pocket and continued walking, the weight of the past heavy on his shoulders. But there was a new resolve in him. The fight wasn't over. He had to keep moving forward. The quiet aftermath of the sting operation settled over the town like a heavy blanket. The news of the arrests spread like wildfire. Corrupt officers who had once roamed the streets with impunity were now behind bars, their criminal network exposed for all to see. The weight of justice had finally come down hard on the system, and for the first time in a long while, the town felt like it could breathe again. Daniel watched from the periphery as the media buzzed around the arrests, but he remained a shadow in the background. No one knew he had been the one to expose the officers. The feds had handled the press, and the local police department was forced to clean up its mess, their reputation irrevocably tarnished. To the world, Daniel was just another grieving father who had lost his beloved dog. But the truth was more complicated. For Daniel, Shadow's death had been the spark that ignited a fire of vengeance, but it was also a lesson in the long, quiet road toward healing. Lily had sensed the change in her father since the operation. She had seen his steely resolve, his quiet determination to right the wrongs done to their family. She had witnessed how, despite his quiet grief, he was becoming something more than just a man out for vengeance. Daniel was, once again, becoming the protector she had always known him to be. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Daniel and Lily sat together on the porch of their modest home. The sky was streaked with hues of orange and pink, casting a warm glow on their faces. The sound of crickets filled the air, a soft hum that contrasted the tense days that had come before. Lily, still a little fragile from the emotional toll of the past weeks, turned to her father. "Daddy, are we going to be okay?" she asked, her voice small. Her eyes were wide, searching his face for the reassurance that only a father could give. Daniel smiled gently, his heart heavy but full of resolve. He had come to terms with what had happened, with what he had done. He hadn't just avenged Shadow's death. He had done something bigger. He had dismantled a system that was broken and had given the town a chance to heal. "We're going to be okay," Daniel replied softly, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We're stronger than we think." Lily leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her cheek. Despite everything, she felt safe. For the first time in weeks, the tension that had clouded their home began to lift, like the last remnants of a storm passing. They were safe, and they were free. Later that night, after Lily had gone to bed, Daniel returned to the garage. The workbench was cluttered with tools, blueprints, and half-finished projects, remnants of a life lived with purpose. But there was something different in the air tonight. Something lighter. He approached the corner of the garage where a small crate sat. Inside, a pair of brown eyes blinked up at him, bright and curious. Echo, the German Shepherd puppy he had brought home to Lily a week ago, was looking up at him with the same loyalty that Shadow had once shown. Daniel crouched down and opened the crate. Echo bounded out, tail wagging energetically as the pup jumped up to greet him. For the first time in what felt like forever, Daniel laughed, a deep, genuine sound that seemed to surprise him. The bond that he had shared with Shadow was irreplaceable, But this was a new beginning. Echo wasn't a replacement. He was a symbol of renewal. As Daniel stroked Echo's soft fur, the puppy sat beside him, placing a paw on his knee. For the first time in a long while, Daniel felt the stirring of hope. The pain of Shadow's loss wasn't gone, but it no longer controlled him. The healing had begun. He stood up and walked into the house, Echo following closely behind. When he entered the living room, Lily was sitting on the couch, her eyes tired but hopeful. "Daddy," Lily said with a smile, "do you think Shadow would have liked Echo?" Daniel's chest tightened as he thought of Shadow, but then he looked down at the puppy at his side, tail wagging with joy. "I think Shadow would have liked him very much," he said quietly. "He was a protector, just like Echo will be." Lily's face lit up. "You think so?" Daniel nodded, the weight of the past still there, but the promise of a brighter future finally beginning to take shape. "Yes," he said, "Shadow's spirit will always be with us, and now we have a new friend to help us move forward." As they sat together, Echo curled up at their feet, the quiet hum of the evening settling around them. Daniel realized that the pain of losing Shadow would always be with him, but it didn't have to define him. He had faced his darkest moments and emerged stronger. The family he had fought so hard to protect was still standing, still whole. And with Echo by their side, there was a sense of renewal, a new chapter, filled with the promise of love, healing, and hope.